is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse, hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and this is part 2 of our interview with Jim Zub. Now, if you haven't heard part 1 yet, hit pause on this podcast, go back and download part 1. We're talking about the Young Adventurer's Guides, and it is not to be missed. Now, if you've already heard that one, then you know we're here to talk about Dungeons & Dragons versus Rick and Morty, and if you're listening to this podcast, that box set is out in stores now. Just a heads up, we do work a little bit blue on this episode because we're talking about Rick and Morty. So for those with sensitive ears, I've made some adjustments to the audio that I learned from my favorite episode of SpongeBob SquarePants, Sailor Mouth. So check it out and enjoy part 2 of our interview with Jim Zub. That's very cool. Well, I'd like to pivot for a second because I don't want to get you in any hot water. I want to talk about something that is definitely coming out soon, which is the next chapter in the saga of the Legends of Baldur's Gate.
Oh, yeah. Infernal Tides is the 5th miniseries connected together with the same party of adventurers for the Dungeons & Dragons comic series. And that comes out in November, late November. Each one of the miniseries that we've done have used kind of different material from a release on the Dungeons & Dragons schedule. So this one is built around Descent into Avernus. And it's extra special to me because I did story development on Descent into Avernus, and Max Dunbar, the artist on the comic, did art development on Descent into Avernus. So we both got pretty heavy credits in the actual game books, and now we get to make a comic that uses the same material to sort of drive our Baldur's Gate heroes to hell and back.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's good. It's genuinely Max is doing the best art of his career. It's kind of blowing me away. Like, I wrote the thing and he sends artwork and I'm just absolutely gobsmacked at how beautiful it looks and the terrifying amount of stuff that I'm asking him to draw and how he is just like leaps and bounds beyond even my imagination with it. It is just absolutely stunning stuff.
And this is going to be a 6-issue series?
5 issues, yeah. So all the miniseries we've done for D&D have been 5 issues.
I think that's like the right amount of comic.
Yeah, it's nice. It's a good chunk of material, but we don't wear out our welcome. The first one we did was Legends of Baldur's Gate, and that came out right at the same time as the D&D 5th edition launch. So we have some sort of loose tethers to the Tyranny of Dragons release, but you can read it fresh, just dive right in and everything you need is right there. The second one we did was called Shadows of the Vampire, and that one takes the group to the demi-plane of Ravenloft, which was right around the time of Curse of Strahd. The third one is called Frost Giant's Fury, and that one was right around, Storm King's Thunder. The fourth one is actually the only one that didn't really use a specific release. It's a series of one-off stories, one focused on each character. So it gave us a way to sort of fill out the backstories of these characters and show you a little bit more in depth who they are and what motivates them. And that was called collectively Evil at Baldur's Gate. And we put them back into the city at the end of it, which set us up for Infernal Tides. So I already knew, a year in advance how Descent into Avernus starts and that it takes place in Baldur's Gate. And so I teed up the cast specifically for this story.
I got to admit, I'm having an internal crisis because I've been pronouncing Avernus wrong my entire life, and I'm thinking a lot about that.
How did you pronounce it?
Avernus.
Avernus?
Yeah.
I'm sure that someone would tell you it's one or the other. When I was a kid, I would always say melee, like melee damage instead of melee, right? And even to this day, I will fall back into it sometimes. I can't help it.
But that's the thing, right? It doesn't matter, but it does.
Right? Well, but the thing for me was I was learning so many words from role-playing game books and reading Marvel comics because those writers would use, scientific words or descriptive words I'd never seen before. And I'd almost instantly add them to my vocabulary because I wanted to sound smart, but I would mispronounce a bunch of them anyways.
My group at the height of Drizzt fever was very into scimitars, and everybody was playing a ranger, of course. And yes, they pronounced it scimitar.
Scimitar.
My mom would be watching Jeopardy in the next room, and she'd hear them say, like, I swing my scimitar, and she lost it one night. It was just like, it's scimitar. The sea is soft.
My parents thought it was incredibly funny when I walked into the room and they were watching a racing program, and I said, "Is that the Grand Prix?" You know, everyone's got our problems. We do the best we can.
Oh, man. So one of the things I'm really excited about is I know you definitely have coming out the Days of Endless Adventure. That's dropping on December 3rd. Do you think that's a great jumping on point for people who want to get into your Baldur's Gate work?
Yeah, absolutely. So that is the first 3 comic stories all collected together in one beautiful omnibus. And the artwork is by, if you've seen those limited editions that D&D has been doing, the limited edition for the Avernus book or for the Player's Handbook and the DMG and everything, those beautiful on the black cover with the iconic kind of silver artwork. I think the artist name is Hydro72.
Hydro 74.
Yeah.
74.
I was going to say 76 and Hambone met us in the middle.
We're all just somewhere in there, 70-something. Hydro 74 has done a brand new cover for Days of Endless Adventure, which is, the collection of the first 3 altogether. And it looks stunning. So, yeah, that's kind of the preferred format now going forward. If you want to dive into the D&D comics, please, pick it on up and go wild with it. And while you're at it, pick up Rick and Morty versus Dungeons and Dragons as well.
So that's actually something I wanted to talk about as well. I find it really interesting that you've had a lot of experience writing very unique voices for many different characters. I mean, you've done Wolverine, you've done Rory Lane, Samurai Jack, Minx and Boo. But talk to me about what it takes to get into the mindset to write Rick Sanchez.
I don't know if I should be proud or not of the fact that it just comes out of you like any other role-playing game character. The bitterness and the nihilism is buried a little too shallow.
That seems very strange in the context of our larger conversation.
I know, we've been talking about all this joyous stuff, and then I'm like, I can get very angry sometimes. So Pat Rothfuss and I wrote the Rick and Morty versus Dungeons and Dragons comic series that came out last year, the 4-issue miniseries, and really put our all into it. We wanted to make it a love letter to the gaming hobby and D&D, and also kind of a treatise on the cast of Rick and Morty. And because role-playing games are about empowerment, what kind of characters would they choose, and how would those character choices change them, and what would it say about their behavior? And we got way too into it. We were obsessed with finding those intersection points and not just half-assing this and putting out a cheap knockoff tie-in product. But, Pat's really, he's an architect. He builds stuff and he's very creative. And he would send me these just fire hoses of conversations and dialogue between characters. And figuring out whether or not we could even fit that on the page was kind of a challenge.
You're telling me Pat Rothfuss is wordy? You don't say.
He's a little wordy. I'm a little wordy at times too. It was a scary combination. And poor, amazing Troy Little, who had to try and direct the lightning onto the page and make it all look awesome and make sense and be funny. And we would do these huge diatribes as Rick Sanchez. And some of the stuff made it onto the final page. And some of it was almost just like an exercise in getting into the mode. Do you know what I mean? Like he would make 5 points about a particular thing about D&D, and then this was the most salient one, so that's the one that made it onto the page. But you just got into the headspace of how the way that Rick Sanchez games also makes his flaws so clear,
This is such a dark place.
He's such a flawed character.
It is. He's a really interesting character. And so when the comic launched to way more acclaim and kind of, I think, sales than any of us were expecting. Wiz the Coast was approving all this stuff, but it really got their attention. They were like, this is kind of wild. And I don't know who approached who, whether it was Adult Swim approaching Wizards or Wizards approaching Adult Swim, and decided they were going to make a game product. And they got in touch with, obviously, the comic publishers, and they mentioned to me that it was happening. And they said, are you interested in being involved? I said, I would love to be involved. What does that entail? And it almost, I guess, sort of similar to the Young Adventurers Guide. So like, well, you can just read stuff over and give feedback. And I was like, I don't get to write any of it. And they're like, well, if you want to, do you have time? No, but I kind of need to, it would be awesome.
Detecting a pattern here.
Yeah. One of the things we talked about was, we were going to make something like the starter set. So there would be a rule book and then there would be an adventure. And I said, what does a Rick Sanchez Dungeons and Dragons rule book feel like? And so I started going through the starter set rules and just writing anecdotes and writing annotations, like Rick's crossing whole sections out and saying, just ignore that. That's not how you play. And then his own little sidebar charts where he would say, this is what I want you to do, Morty, or, this is how the game should work, or, when I'm the dungeon master, you have to do these things, but when I'm the player, you do it for me like this, like that. The two-facedness had to be so obvious and blatant that it was funny, right? And I just kept writing and writing and writing, and I wasn't sure we were going to use it. I was just like, I need to understand how Rick sees the game on a crunch level, on a rules level. And so, oh man, I think I actually have the document. This is going to be terrifying.
This is like the best inside baseball that we've gotten since we started this podcast.
There we go. Starter set. I've got 15,000 words.
Oh my God.
Wow.
About Rick's approach to role-playing games and the rules of D&D. And none of these are rules except for the occasional table that he puts together. This is all just diatribes about what to do, what not to do, or whether or not people are idiots or whether or not they're doing the game the way he would,
What kind of period of time was this 15,000 words?
I think I did it about over maybe 2 or 3 weeks.
Wow.
Yeah, I would just sort of pour this thing out, and then I would get on a good roll, and I would just write and write and write and write and write, and then I would go back to it, and I would reread it back. One of the things I do with comic dialogue is I read it out loud because I want it to sound like the cadence of that character. So if you're writing Samurai Jack, you talk like Samurai Jack, or you talk like Ku, the shape-shifting master of darkness. Or, if I'm writing Strahd, like he shows up in Shadows of the Vampire, I'm going to talk like Strahd. I want to read that dialogue back. And does it feel like it's coming out of him? And so I'm literally reading and rereading this stuff out loud. I've got my door closed and my wife walks by the door and can hear me just ranting as Rick. Or I would read, sections to her that I thought were particularly funny. And if it got a rise out of her, I was like, okay, we're getting there. This is going to work.
Question is, I think the last really R-rated product that Wizards of the Coast put out was the Book of Vile Darkness.
Right.
How R-rated does Wizards allow you to get now, knowing what the climate is in 2019?
So they censor all the swearing, but it's just asterisked out. So it's pretty obvious. It'll have the first letter of the swear word and then the last letter. So it's obvious what it is.
It's kind of my favorite kind of swearing.
Do you have swearing in your podcast?
We don't really swear that much. However, if it comes up, it comes up.
Okay.
We made a decision early on not to drop the F-bomb at whimsy. And, some guests come on can I swear? I'm like, we're not going to stop you.
Right.
I edit it, but I'm not editing that.
Right. So, I could read to you a section if you want to beep stuff out.
Nah, just go for it.
Okay. I haven't done my Rick voice in a while. This could really suck. So if you were to read the starter set, there's a section right after the table of contents that says how to play. And it talks about real high level stuff. This is what a role-playing game is. And the last sentence in that introduction of the starter set says, in this fantasy world, the possibilities are limitless. And then right at that point, Rick's annotation starts. And it goes, that's a really poetic opening, Morty, and it's kind of mostly true. But the theater major who wrote that forgot to mention the most important part of Dungeons and Dragons: power, Morty. People play this game because they want limitless power, and they want treasure, and they want to act like a complete badass all the time. Honestly, it's the illusion of power, Morty. We play games to distract ourselves from the reality of the universe. It's an unfeeling, uncontrollable shitstorm, and everything we do is meaningless. But that's fine. It's fine. It's just a baseline assumption we have to make because it's a human game, and we are human people. We're not paying glabins and gluncheons with a bunch of Bloofians. No, we're not. So Dungeons and Dragons is like a portal gun. It's a portal gun to infinite ideas and infinite power without needing to be a genius like me, Morty. It's not as good as a portal gun, but it's a lot cheaper. It doesn't require unstable energy sources to operate. So it's good. It's good stuff, Morty.
Did your interpersonal relationships suffer while you were writing this?
it's a weird thing. Like, I'm writing this stuff and I'm talking miserably about, the most selfish parts of D&D, but also truisms about the way people play, the way people can be petty and silly and foolish and ridiculous, but that's kind of also the joy of the game. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
I remember reading about Scorsese. He would add more violence to a movie than he actually thought would ever make it to the final theatrical cut, because that way the censors would come in and they would ask him to cut out the most extreme stuff that he honestly didn't need to have in there anyways. And he would get the violence he wanted by pushing it too far. And there were things that I threw into the commentary here that I sent over to Kate Welsh, who is a beautiful, wonderful human being who I don't know how she wrangled this monster of a project. And I sent it to her with the full intent that they would cut me at the knees and go, there is no way you can talk that way about Wizards of the Coast. There is no way that you can say that about D&D or anything. And she came back and she goes, looks great. And I was like,
yeah.
Are you sure? And she was just like, yeah. We're going to send it over to Adult Swim for approval. And I was like, well, you are the guys that I'm worried about. Like, Adult Swim doesn't care if I rip on D&D. They're not going to tell me to stop. And they let literally almost every single joke through the filter. And that is simultaneously wonderful and terrifying to me.
Good on them,
I am genuinely nervously excited for people to read this starter set. There's an appendix at the back of the rule book. It's called Appendix 2 that Rick adds to the back of the rule book. And it says Appendix 2, what is the point? And it's an entire page of Rick going crazy about why we play role-playing games. It's like a treatise on why we spend time with each other, and that buying products doesn't make you a good person, and like capitalism, and like it's absolutely insane.
And Daddy Hasbro let that in?
Oh, baby. It is wild. There's a segment. It's a few pages into the rule book. Where is it? And now I'm scrolling through my own text and barely recognizing it. I swear I wasn't drunk when I wrote this.
I mean, that would be pretty method.
So there's actually, in the original starter set rule book, there's a little sidebar that says, what's next? And it tells you, these advanced rulebooks introduce you to the vast multiverse of D&D and invite you to create your own unique characters and worlds. And then they have a quick bullet-pointed list of other products to buy. And Rick puts a big note over top of it, or at least, I did. And it says, damn, Morty, it's only page 4 and these sons of bitches are going for the upsell. And I'm like, they're never going to let me make fun of them trying to sell more products. And that note is absolutely in the final. That's right in there.
When does this come out? Because maybe we should push it until afterwards.
It comes out on the 19th of November. Pre-order available now.
It was #1 in Sword and Sorcery on Amazon last week.
Wow.
I think the takeaway from me for Wizards currently is that they're really enjoying what they're doing and they're not taking themselves too seriously. And you could tell in a lot of the things that they do.
No, and that's what was so great about it. Like when we were working on the comic and when we've been working on the game product for the Rick and Morty stuff, when you're the biggest, you can take it. People can make fun of you and you laugh it off because you're doing it right. You're kicking butt. And they are crushing it so much more than they ever have before. D&D is bigger than it's ever been before. The fan base is massive and wonderful and so supportive. And I think that there's this joyous confidence that comes with that they can take the shots because they know that it's done in a joyous and celebratory way, right? Like at the end of the day, Rick and Morty versus D&D is a love letter to D&D. And that includes the kind of warts that make D&D very particular, you know what I mean? And that Pat and I can get under their skin because we know the stuff intimately and we love it. And that's like your best friend. They know all your flaws and they can just pull that out of you and simultaneously make you laugh and wince. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
That's a very special thing. And the kind of, it sounds a little dramatic, but like a special relationship when you can do that, when you can dig deep and say something heartfelt and cutting at the same time,
I agree. And I think that I didn't imagine that the interview would go this way, but man, you are really doing that emotional selling, man. I'm good.
Thanks.
I'm about to hit pre-order on a bunch of products right now.
I appreciate it. That's really cool, man. Like, honestly, this year has been so utterly surreal. I went to D&D Live back in May, and that was like, 3 days of this press event, and we did the Descent live game on stage. We announced Descent into Avernus, streamed it out to hundreds of thousands of players, and interacted with some of the most passionate and excited people in the community. And I got to meet a bunch of writers and creators and artists whose work has meant so much to me. It was like D&D camp. Like, we had the best time and we all got to hang out. And I'm thinking to myself, this is my job. Like, this is what I do for a living. 2019 has been a real banner year for me, and D&D has been an absolutely huge part of that. It's just been a joy. It's been one of the most incredible experiences of my life.
So, Jim, for our listeners, where can the people find you online?
It's nice and simple. Just jimzub.com. So JIMZUB.com. And I've got, previews and interviews on there for my upcoming comic projects and game projects. There's a rundown of what conventions I'll be at and ordering links for all my books. There's also tutorials on how to write comics, how to pitch your stuff to a publisher.
Jim, thank you again so much.
My absolute pleasure.
Thanks so much to Jim Zub for calling in for an interview. Dungeons & Dragons vs. Rick and Morty is in stores now. You could also find Descent into Avernus and the Young Adventurer's Guides wherever you buy your books. If you're looking for Jim's comics, you could either head over to your local comic book store or go to jimzub.com, and he definitely has links to pick up some of his work. The Vintage RPG Podcast is now coming at you weekly, so don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast. Your reviews are what helps other listeners to find us. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dega West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.